You're walking to your car after a long day, footsteps echoing in the concrete tomb beneath the city. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead, casting dancing shadows between the pillars. You press the unlock button on your keys, and in that brief moment of silence, you hear something that makes your blood freeze. Every year, over 1,400 people simply vanish in parking structures across America, their cars found running, doors wide open, but no trace of the driver. Security cameras capture their final moments before they disappear into the darkness between levels that officially don't exist. What you're about to hear are 7 documented accounts from people who encountered something unnatural in these underground labyrinths. These aren't urban legends passed down through generations. These are recent testimonies from security guards, maintenance workers, and ordinary people who descended into America's parking garages and discovered that some spaces beneath our cities were never meant to be found. Each story has been verified through police reports, security footage, and witness statements that defy logical explanation. Before we descend into these concrete depths together, make sure to click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon, because once you hear these accounts, you'll never look at an underground parking garage the same way again. The authorities tried to suppress these stories, but the truth has a way of surfacing, even from the deepest levels below. Tonight, we're going down to Sublevel 0, where the elevators don't stop, the security cameras malfunction, and something is waiting in the spaces between the painted lines. Are you ready to discover what really happens when the last car leaves and the lights go out? Story 1. Marcos Chen had been working security at the Millennium Tower in downtown Chicago for 8 years, and he thought he'd seen everything during those lonely midnight shifts patrolling the 15-level underground parking garage. The job paid well enough to support his family, and most nights were routine, checking doors, monitoring the security feeds, and making sure the wealthy residents' expensive cars remained untouched in their designated spots. But on the night of March 15th, 2024, everything changed when the security system began malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation. It started around 2:47 a.m. when camera 14 on sublevel B7 went completely black, displaying nothing but static on his monitor. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and radio, making his way down the concrete stairwell to investigate what he assumed was a simple technical glitch. The garage was eerily quiet as he descended, his footsteps echoing off the low concrete ceiling, the fluorescent lights casting their usual sickly yellow glow across the rows of parked vehicles. When he reached B7, everything appeared normal. Expensive sedans and SUVs sitting silently in their spots, the camera mounted securely in its corner. Housing. He radioed back to the security office that everything looked fine, but when his partner Kevin checked the monitor, the feed was still showing pure static. That's when Marcus noticed something that made his skin crawl. In the far corner of B7, partially hidden behind a concrete support pillar, was a car he'd never seen before. It was an old sedan, maybe from the 1980s, with rust eating away at its pale blue paint and a layer of dust so thick it looked like it hadn't been moved in years. This was impossible because Marcus personally checked every level every night, and this car definitely hadn't been there during his 11 p.m. rounds. More disturbing was the fact that it was parked in spot 247, which according to the building's records didn't exist. The numbering system jumped from 246 directly to 248. As Marcus approached the mysterious vehicle, his radio crackled with Kevin's panicked voice reporting that camera 15 on B8 had just gone black, followed immediately by camera 16 on B9. The blackouts were spreading downward through the garage levels like some kind of digital infection, and Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. He shined his flashlight through the sedan's dirty windows and saw something that made him stumble backward. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat. The figure was completely motionless, hands positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead through the windshield at the concrete wall. Marcus called out, asking if the person needed help, but there was no response, no acknowledgement that he was even there. He knocked on the driver's side window and the sound echoed through the garage like a gunshot. but the figure never moved, never turned to look at him. That's when Marcus noticed the person's clothing, a security uniform identical to his own, complete with the Millennium Tower logo and name tag. But as he leaned closer to read the name, his blood turned to ice because the tag read Marcus Chen. His own name was staring back at him from the chest of this motionless figure who shared his face, his build, even the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident. Kevin's voice crackled over the radio again, more frantic now, reporting that all cameras on levels B10 through B15 had simultaneously gone dark, and something was wrong with the elevator system. It was showing floors that shouldn't exist, sublevel indicators going down to B23 when the building only had 15 underground levels. Marcus backed away from the impossible car and its impossible occupant, his heart hammering against his ribs as he tried to process what he was seeing. He grabbed his radio to report the situation, but when he pressed the talk button, the only sound that came through was his own voice saying, "Everything looks fine down here, Kevin. All clear on B7. But Marcus hadn't spoken those words. The voice was coming from the radio without him opening his mouth, reporting back to the security office in his exact tone and inflection. He looked back at the sedan and saw that the figure in the driver's seat had turned to face him, its dead eyes reflecting his flashlight beam like pools of black water. The thing wearing his face smiled, and Marcus realized with growing horror that this wasn't the first time this had happened. Somewhere in his memory, buried deep and almost forgotten, was the recollection of finding this same car on this same night, month after month, year after year. Kevin's voice came through the radio one final time, but it was different now, older and filled with a resignation that Marcus didn't understand. "Marcus, you need to get back up here. Your replacement just clocked in for the morning shift. Your 8 years are up." As Marcus turned to run toward the stairwell, he heard the sedan's engine start behind him, the sound of a car that had been waiting patiently in spot 247 for someone to take the wheel and continue the endless patrol of sublevel B7, where the cameras never worked and time moved in circles, trapping security guards in an underground purgatory where their shift never truly ends. Story 2. Elena Rodriguez had been working late at Westfield Corporate Center in Seattle for 3 months, and she'd grown accustomed to being the last person in the building on most nights. As a financial analyst for a tech startup on the 42nd floor, she often found herself buried in spreadsheets until well past midnight, the city lights twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows while the office grew eerily quiet around her. On the night of April 8, 2024, she finally packed up her laptop around 1:30 a.m. and made her way to the elevator bank, exhausted and looking forward to the drive home to her small apartment in Capitol Hill. The building's parking garage extended 7 levels underground, and her assigned spot was on B5, deep enough that cell phone reception was spotty, and the concrete walls seemed to press in from all sides. She pressed the call button and waited, listening to the familiar mechanical sounds of the elevator ascending from somewhere far below. When the doors opened, she stepped inside and pressed B5, but as the elevator began its descent, she noticed something odd about the button panel. There was an additional button below all the others, unmarked and slightly smaller than the rest, glowing with a faint amber light she'd never noticed before. Elena tried to dismiss it as fatigue playing tricks on her eyes, but as the elevator continued downward, she realized they'd already passed B7, the lowest level according to the building directory. The floor indicator above the doors was showing symbols she didn't recognize. Not numbers or letters, but strange geometric shapes that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. Her stomach lurched as the elevator continued its impossible descent, and she frantically pressed the B5 button repeatedly, but nothing happened. The elevator seemed to be moving slower now, and she could hear strange sounds coming from beyond the metal doors. Not the typical mechanical noises of a building's infrastructure, but something that sounded almost organic, like breathing or the rustling of enormous wings. When the elevator finally stopped with a soft chime, the doors opened to reveal a parking level that shouldn't exist. The ceiling was impossibly high, disappearing into darkness above the reach of the flickering fluorescent lights, and the concrete floor stretched out in all directions like an underground cathedral. But what made Elena's heart race with terror were the cars. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, arranged in perfect rows that extended far beyond what the building's footprint should allow. Every vehicle was identical, the same make, model, year, and color as her own Honda Civic, down to the small dent in the rear bumper from a parking incident 6 months ago. Each car sat empty with its keys dangling from the ignition, as if waiting for its owner to return from a brief errand that had stretched into eternity. Elena backed against the elevator wall and pressed every button on the panel, but the doors remained stubbornly open, and the unmarked button at the bottom continued to glow with that unsettling amber light. She could hear footsteps now, echoing from somewhere deep within the maze of identical vehicles, not the sharp click of heels or the soft padding of sneakers, but the wet, squelching sound of bare feet on concrete. The footsteps were getting closer, and Elena realized with growing dread that there wasn't just one set, but dozens, maybe hundreds, all moving in perfect synchronization toward the elevator. She pressed the closed door button desperately, but instead of sealing her inside the safety of the elevator car, the doors opened wider, revealing more of the impossible parking level and the approaching crowd of figures that emerged from between the cars. They were all women who looked exactly like Elena. Same height, same dark hair, same business attire, but their eyes were completely black and their mouths hung open in silent screams. Each one carried a briefcase identical to hers, and they moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. The closest Elena thing reached the elevator and stepped inside, standing directly behind the real Elena with its head tilted at an impossible angle. When it spoke, the voice was Elena's own, but layered with echoes as if coming from a great distance. "You're late for the meeting. They've been waiting for you down here." More identical figures crowded into the elevator, pressing against Elena from all sides, their cold skin radiating a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. The elevator doors finally closed, but instead of ascending, it continued downward, past levels marked with increasingly disturbing symbols, while the Elena things whispered in unison about reports that needed to be filed, deadlines that could never be met, and a corporate structure that extended infinitely downward into the Earth's core. When Elena finally managed to scream, the sound was absorbed by the pressing bodies around her, and she realized that somewhere far above, another woman was probably working late in an office on the 42nd floor, unaware that her elevator ride home would soon take her to Sublevel 0, where punctuality was eternal and the work never ended. Story 3. Jamie Thompson had always been fascinated by abandoned places, and the defunct Northland Mall parking structure in Detroit represented the perfect exploration opportunity for someone with a YouTube channel dedicated to urban decay. The mall had closed in 2015, but the massive concrete parking garage remained largely intact, a 5-story brutalist monument to America's retail apocalypse that drew explorers from across the Midwest. On May 22, 2024, Jamie arrived at the structure around 11 p.m. with her camera equipment and high-powered flashlights, planning to document the graffiti and deterioration that had claimed the building over the past 9 years. The entrance barriers had long since been removed, and accessing the lower levels was as simple as walking down the vehicle ramps, though the complete absence of lighting made navigation treacherous without artificial illumination. What Jamie didn't expect was the acoustic phenomenon that began manifesting as soon as she reached the second sublevel. Every sound she made seemed to echo back with a delay of exactly 30 seconds, but the returning echoes carried sounds that she hadn't made. When Jamie called out "hello" to test the acoustics, 30 seconds later she heard her own voice respond with "help me," spoken in the exact same tone and inflection but with words she'd never said. Her footsteps on the concrete created a rhythm that returned as the sound of running, panicked breathing, and what sounded like someone stumbling and falling in the darkness. Jamie initially attributed this to the unusual architecture of the parking structure, convinced that the curved concrete walls and low ceilings were creating some kind of acoustic delay that was mixing her sounds with residual noise from other urban explorers who might have visited recently. But as she descended deeper into the structure, reaching levels that had been flooded and abandoned for years, the delayed echoes began telling a story that made her blood run cold. Every word she spoke was returned as part of a conversation, her voice pleading with someone to stop following her, begging for help, screaming warnings about something lurking in the flooded sections of the lower levels. The most disturbing aspect was that the echo voice seemed to know things that Jamie didn't, referencing specific details about the parking structure's layout and history that she hadn't researched. When Jamie whispered, "This place gives me the creeps," the 30-second echo returned as, "The water on B4 isn't from flooding. It's from the broken pipes where they tried to wash away the blood." Jamie had no knowledge of any violent incidents at the mall, but the echo voice continued providing increasingly specific and horrifying details about murders, disappearances, and occult activities that had allegedly taken place in the parking structure over the decades. She tried to remain rational, convincing herself that the sounds were just distorted echoes of her own voice combined with environmental noise. But when she reached the third sublevel and accidentally kicked an empty bottle, the returning sound 30 seconds later was the unmistakable noise of multiple glass objects shattering simultaneously, followed by what sounded like a crowd of people screaming in terror. Jamie decided to leave immediately, but as she climbed back toward the entrance, she realized that the echo delay was shortening with each level she ascended. 25 seconds on sublevel 2, 20 seconds on sublevel 1, 15 seconds at ground level. The voices in the echoes were becoming more urgent, more desperate, warning her about something that was climbing up from the flooded depths, matching her pace as she tried to escape. By the time she reached the entrance ramp, the delay had shortened to just 5 seconds, and the echo voice was no longer her own, but belonged to someone else entirely. A man's voice, raw with panic, shouting, "It's right behind you, run!" Jamie sprinted to her car and drove away without looking back, but when she reviewed the audio recordings from her equipment the next day, she discovered that the 30-second delay wasn't an acoustic phenomenon at all. The timestamps on her recording device showed that the echo responses were actually happening before she spoke, meaning that somehow, impossibly, she was hearing the sounds of her own future actions played back in reverse chronological order. The most terrifying discovery came at the end of the recording, where her future voice could be heard saying, "I'm going back tomorrow night to figure out what's happening down there," followed by sounds of a struggle, screaming, and then 30 seconds of silence that stretched on for hours, suggesting that Jamie Thompson's exploration of the Northland Mall parking structure wasn't finished, and that somewhere in the concrete depths, time moved backward while something waited patiently for her inevitable return. Story 4. David Kim had been working as a maintenance technician at the Bellagio Casino's parking garage in Las Vegas for 6 years, and he thought he'd seen every possible malfunction that could plague the building's electrical systems. The casino's underground parking structure was a maze of 7 levels serving thousands of guests daily, with a complex network of fluorescent lighting that required constant attention due to the desert heat and 24-hour operation schedule. On the night of June 14, 2024, David received an emergency call around 3:30 a.m. about flickering lights on sublevel B6, a problem that had been plaguing that particular section for weeks despite multiple repair attempts. Armed with his toolkit and a replacement batch of fluorescent tubes, he descended to the nearly empty parking level, where only a handful of cars remained scattered across the vast concrete expanse. The problematic lighting section was in the northeast corner, where a bank of 12 fluorescent fixtures had been cycling through periods of normal illumination, followed by rapid strobing that guests had complained was triggering headaches and disorientation. As David began replacing the first set of bulbs, he noticed something peculiar about the flickering pattern. It wasn't random electrical failure, but seemed to follow a specific rhythm, almost like Morse code or some kind of visual communication. When the lights strobed, The brief moments of darkness revealed glimpses of the parking garage that didn't match what he could see during normal illumination. In the split-second flashes, David caught sight of cars that weren't there when the lights were steady, people walking between vehicles who vanished the moment full lighting returned, and, most disturbing of all, architectural features that shouldn't exist. Additional concrete pillars, different wall configurations, and what appeared to be openings leading to sections of the garage that he'd never seen before in his 6 years of working there. David tried to convince himself that the rapid light changes were creating optical illusions, but as he continued working, the flickering became more intense and the alternate reality glimpses more detailed and consistent. During one particularly long, strobing sequence, David found himself face to face with another version of himself, an identical maintenance worker wearing the same uniform, holding the same tools, but with eyes that reflected no light and skin that had the pale, waxy appearance of someone who had been dead for weeks. The other, David mouthed words that the real David couldn't hear over the electrical humming, but the lip movements clearly formed the phrase, "You're not supposed to see this." When the lights returned to steady illumination, David was alone again, but he noticed that his toolkit was now arranged differently, and there were additional tools present that he didn't remember bringing. Older, corroded versions of his. Equipment that looked like they'd been sitting in the damp underground environment for years. The lights began flickering again, faster now, and David realized with growing terror that each time they strobed, he was seeing deeper into what appeared to be multiple versions of the same parking garage, layered on top of each other like transparent photographs, each one showing different time periods and different states of decay. In the rapidly alternating realities, David watched himself perform the same maintenance tasks over and over again, but each iteration showed him at different ages, sometimes younger, sometimes decades older, sometimes as a skeleton in a maintenance uniform still dutifully replacing fluorescent bulbs with bones that clicked against the metal fixtures. He saw versions of the parking garage from different eras, one where it was brand new and gleaming, another where it was partially collapsed and flooded, and most horrifying of all, one where the concrete walls were covered in what looked like thousands of maintenance reports, all signed by David Kim and dated years into the future, describing repair jobs that would never end. The flickering reached a crescendo, and David found himself moving between these layered realities with each flash, experiencing fragments of conversations with supervisors he'd never met, completing work orders for problems that hadn't happened yet, and slowly understanding that the electrical malfunction wasn't a technical issue but a temporal one. The fluorescent lights weren't just illuminating the parking garage, they were revealing the truth about his job, his life, and his fate, showing him that some maintenance contracts extend far beyond death, binding technicians to their duties in an endless cycle of repairs in the spaces between moments. When the strobing finally stopped and steady light returned, David found himself holding a work order dated 50 years in the future, written in his own handwriting, requesting immediate attention to flickering lights on Sublevel B6, and he realized that he had just begun an assignment that would last forever. Story 5. Sarah Mitchell had been working the night shift at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City for 2 years, and she'd grown accustomed to the eerie atmosphere that settled over the medical complex after midnight when most of the daytime staff had gone home. As a trauma nurse, she often worked until 4 a.m., and the walk to her car in the hospital's underground parking garage had become a routine part of her shift that she'd never given much thought to until the night of July 3rd, 2024. The garage served the hospital's staff and extended 4 levels underground, with her assigned parking spot on B3 near the elevator bank that provided quick access to the emergency department. That night, as Sarah made her way through the dimly lit concrete structure, she noticed someone she'd never seen before standing near the entrance to the stairwell. A man in an old-fashioned parking attendant uniform complete with a cap and clipboard who appeared to be checking license plates and making notes. This was unusual because the hospital parking garage had been self-service for over a decade, with electronic gates and payment kiosks that eliminated the need for human attendants. Sarah approached the man to ask if he needed help, assuming he might be a new security hire, or perhaps someone who was lost and wandering the garage in confusion. But when she got closer, she noticed that his uniform was not just old-fashioned but genuinely vintage. The fabric had the texture and cut of clothing from the 1950s, and his clipboard was made of real wood rather than the plastic versions used today. The man looked up from his notes and smiled at Sarah with a warmth that seemed genuine, but his eyes were completely black, like pools of motor oil reflecting the fluorescent lights overhead. He spoke in a pleasant, professional tone that carried just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "Good evening, Miss Mitchell. Running a bit late tonight, aren't we? Your usual spot is still available, but I'm afraid there's been a change in the parking regulations that requires your immediate attention." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine because she'd never told this man her name, and she was certain she'd never seen him before in her 2 years of working at the hospital. She asked him who he was and what authority he had to make changes to the parking system, but his smile never wavered as he consulted his wooden clipboard and began reading from a list that seemed to contain detailed information about her personal life, her home address, her work schedule, the make and model of her car, and, most disturbing of all, a complete record of every time she'd parked in the garage, going back to her very first day of employment. The attendant explained that due to new safety regulations, all night shift employees were required to park on Sublevel B5, a level that Sarah knew didn't exist because the garage only went down to B4. When she pointed this out, the man's black eyes seemed to grow even darker, and he gestured toward the stairwell with a gloved hand that she now realized was far too pale to belong to a living person. Following the attendant's directions against her better judgment, Sarah descended the stairwell past B4 and found herself on a level that definitely hadn't been there during her previous 2 years of parking in the garage. B5 was older than the upper levels, with different concrete that looked weathered and stained, and lighting fixtures that belonged to an earlier era of the hospital's history. The parking spaces were marked with paint that had faded to barely visible lines, and every spot was occupied by cars from decades past. Vintage sedans, station wagons, and vehicles she recognized from old movies but had never seen in person. Each car had a hospital employee parking permit displayed on the dashboard, but the permits were yellowed with age and bore dates from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The attendant appeared beside her without making a sound, consulting his clipboard once more before pointing to an empty space marked S. Mitchell in fresh white paint that still smelled of chemicals. As Sarah reluctantly moved toward the designated spot, she began to understand the true nature of the parking regulations on B5. This was where the hospital's night shift employees were assigned permanently, their cars joining the vintage collection while their names were added to the attendant's eternal roster. The man in the old-fashioned uniform smiled one final time as Sarah realized that her nursing shift would never truly end, because some hospitals have employees who clock in but never clock out, serving patients in the spaces between life and death where the work continues forever and the parking is always free. Story 6. Michael O'Brien had been living in the Beacon Hill Apartments in Boston for 3 years, and he'd always found the building's underground parking garage to be unremarkable, just another concrete structure beneath a converted warehouse that housed 200 units of overpriced urban living. The garage extended 2 levels down, with his assigned spot on B2 near the back wall, where the building's foundation met the original stone basement of a textile factory that had operated on the site in the early 1900s. On the night of August 17, 2024, Michael returned home around midnight after a work dinner that had run later than expected, parking his sedan in the familiar spot and preparing for the short walk to the elevator that would take him up to his 4th-floor apartment. But as he stepped out of his car and closed the door, he heard something that made him pause. The sound of crying coming from somewhere deep within the concrete walls themselves, muffled and distant but unmistakably human. The crying seemed to emanate from the oldest section of the garage where the newer concrete met the original stone foundation, creating a junction between the modern parking structure and the building's historical past. Michael had always noticed that this area felt different from the rest of the garage. colder, damper, with a musty smell that reminded him of old churches or underground crypts. As he approached the back wall, following the sound of weeping that grew stronger with each step, he began to make out other sounds as well. Whispered conversations in accents he couldn't identify, the shuffle of footsteps on wooden floors, and what sounded like industrial machinery operating somewhere beyond the concrete barriers. Michael pressed his ear against the cold stone wall and realized that the sounds weren't coming from adjacent spaces or mechanical rooms, but from within the wall itself, as if the stones were somehow containing and replaying audio from the building's past. The crying belonged to a woman, and as Michael listened more intently, he began to distinguish words spoken in what sounded like Irish-accented English from over a century ago. The woman was pleading with someone named Thomas not to go to work, begging him to stay home because she'd had terrible dreams about the factory machines and feared something awful would happen. Other voices joined the conversation, men discussing wages and working conditions, children asking when their father would return, and an older woman praying in what Michael recognized as Gaelic despite not understanding the language. The stone wall felt warm under his palm, and Michael realized with growing unease that the historical sounds were becoming more vivid and detailed, as if his presence was somehow strengthening the connection between past and present. He could hear the woman's husband, Thomas, promising to be careful, the sound of a door closing, and then hours later, screaming, and the terrible noise of machinery grinding to a halt after catching something it was never meant to process. The walls around Michael began to pulse with a rhythmic throbbing, like a massive heartbeat, and the temperature in the garage dropped noticeably as frost began forming on the concrete surfaces. The sounds from the past were no longer muffled but crystal clear, and Michael found himself witnessing an audio recording of a tragedy that had occurred in the textile factory more than a century ago, an industrial accident that had claimed the life of Thomas O'Brien, whose widow had waited by the window of their company housing for a husband who would never come home. The realization hit Michael like a physical blow. Thomas O'Brien shared his surname, and as the ghostly voices continued their lament, he understood that he wasn't just listening to random historical echoes, but to the final conversations of his own great-great-grandfather, whose death in the factory had left a family destitute and desperate in an era when industrial workers had no safety net. The concrete walls had somehow absorbed and preserved the emotional trauma of that long-ago tragedy, and Michael's presence as a descendant had triggered a supernatural playback that was growing stronger and more immersive with each passing moment. The crying woman's voice called out, "Michael, can you hear me?" And Michael realized that the wall wasn't just replaying the past, but somehow bridging the gap between then and now, allowing his ancestor's widow to communicate across more than a century of separation. She warned him about the building, explaining that the apartment complex had been constructed on cursed ground where too many workers had died in industrial accidents, their spirits trapped in the foundation stones that had witnessed their suffering. The wall began to crack and crumble under Michael's hand, revealing glimpses of the original factory floor where ghostly figures in period clothing continued their eternal work shifts, operating phantom machinery that crushed and mangled anyone who ventured too close to the boundary between past and present. Michael tried to step away from the wall, but found that his feet were somehow rooted to the concrete floor, and he understood that the building's history was claiming another O'Brien, drawing him into the same cycle of industrial tragedy that had claimed his ancestor, where the work never stops and the walls remember everything, preserving the pain and loss of generations in the concrete confessional beneath Beacon Hill. Story 7. Ashley Turner had been working as the closing manager at Beverly Center in Los Angeles for 8 months, and she developed a routine for securing the massive shopping complex that served her well during those late-night hours when the glamorous retail environment transformed into something eerily quiet and institutional. Her responsibilities included ensuring all stores were properly locked, checking that security systems were armed, and conducting a final walkthrough of the parking structures before heading home to her apartment in West Hollywood. The Beverly Center's parking garage was a modernist concrete spiral that wrapped around the shopping complex like a giant concrete ribbon, with 7 levels above ground and 3 below, providing spaces for thousands of vehicles during peak shopping hours. On September 9, 2024, Ashley finished her usual closing duties around midnight and made her way to the lowest parking level, B3, where employees were required to park to leave the premium spots available for customers during business hours. As Ashley descended the vehicle ramp to B3, she noticed that the parking level seemed unusually extensive that night, stretching much further than she remembered from her previous 8 months of working at the mall. The fluorescent lighting created pools of harsh illumination separated by deep shadows, and she could see row after row of parking spaces extending into the distance far beyond what the building's footprint should accommodate. Ashley tried to remember the exact layout of B3, but realized that despite parking there almost daily, she'd never really paid attention to the specific dimensions of the space. She'd simply followed the painted lines to her designated employee section near the elevator bank. Tonight, however, something was definitely different about the geometry of the parking level, and as she walked deeper into the structure searching for her car, she began to understand that B3 had somehow expanded beyond the physical limitations of the building above. The parking spaces were all numbered sequentially, but Ashley realized she'd been walking for over 10 minutes and had passed space number 847. Which was impossible because the entire Beverly Center parking structure couldn't possibly contain more than a few hundred spaces total. Her footsteps echoed strangely in the vast concrete space, creating multiple reverberations that suggested the ceiling was much higher than the standard 8 feet of a typical parking garage. When Ashley looked up, she couldn't see the concrete ceiling at all, just darkness that seemed to extend upward indefinitely, as if she was standing at the bottom of a massive concrete shaft that had no top. The painted parking space numbers continued climbing: 1,200, 1,500, 2,000, and Ashley realized with growing panic that she was walking through a parking structure that defied not just the Beverly Center's architectural plans, but the basic laws of physics and geometry. The most disturbing aspect of the infinite parking level was that it wasn't empty. Scattered throughout the endless rows of spaces were cars from different eras, arranged without any apparent pattern or logic. Ashley passed a 1950s Cadillac parked next to a modern Tesla, followed by what appeared to be a horse-drawn carriage occupying a space marked for compact vehicles. Each vehicle looked like it had been abandoned suddenly, with doors left open, keys still in ignitions, and personal belongings scattered on seats as if the owners had simply vanished mid-task. Ashley tried to retrace her steps back to the elevator, but discovered that the path behind her had changed. Where she'd walked just minutes before, there were now different vehicles, different space numbers, different concrete pillars arranged in configurations that definitely hadn't been there during her approach. The parking level had become a labyrinth that rearranged itself constantly, trapping her in an underground maze where the exit moved further away with each step she took toward what she thought was safety. Ashley's phone had no signal in the depths of the impossible parking structure, and her calls for help were swallowed by the vast concrete space without producing even an echo. As she continued searching for an exit that seemed to move further away with each passing hour, she began to encounter other people, or what had once been people, wandering between the parked vehicles with the aimless confusion of shoppers who had lost track of where they'd left their cars. These figures wore clothing from different decades, carried shopping bags from stores that had closed years ago, and moved with the mechanical repetition of individuals trapped in an endless loop of consumer behavior. Ashley realized that the infinite parking level was more than just a spatial anomaly. It was a temporal collection point where everyone who had ever become lost in a parking structure eventually found themselves, condemned to search forever through endless rows of vehicles for cars they would never find and exits that would always remain just out of reach. When Ashley finally understood that she had become part of the Deep Park's permanent collection, she joined the eternal parade of lost shoppers, walking between spaces numbered in the millions while searching for a way home that existed only in the fading memory of a surface world that grew more distant with each step, deeper into the concrete infinity below Beverly Center.